This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. President Donald Trump has promised to make big changes to education in the U.S. that could include major cuts to federal funding and a potential dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education. Trump has also proposed cuts to federal funding for schools that teach critical race theory and transgender content. That's according to the New York Times. More recently, the Trump administration revoked policies limiting where immigration officials can make arrests. Immigration officials can now enter places of worship, healthcare facilities, and even schools. Today, we're unpacking all of that and more. Later, we hear from local educators on how they're preparing for what's ahead. Joining us now to talk about what we've seen so far is Mark Lieberman. He's a school finance reporter with Education Week. Thank you so much, Mark, for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Mark, we've been seeing President Trump signing a slew of executive orders so far, and this includes allowing ICE agents to conduct arrests in schools. So on the campaign trail, he's promised to shut down the U.S. Department of Education. Could you give us your reaction to what we have heard about so far?
Yes. So I'll sort of answer that in two parts. The executive orders that have come out so far, there have been 100, I think, across the federal government. The vast majority of those do not pertain directly to K-12 schools. You mentioned a couple that affect K-12 schools. But as for dismantling the Department of Education, that would require an act of Congress, and I think will prompt a much bigger debate for a couple of reasons. One, dismantling the Department of Education is sort of more complicated than maybe it would seem on the surface, because there's sort of several different ways that could look. One approach would be to simply get rid of the agency entirely and everything that it does no longer happens. That would be the most disruptive scenario. That would be significant for school districts who depend on the federal government for billions of dollars every year. It would have a really dramatic effect on students with disabilities, students in low-income areas, other vulnerable groups of students whose schools depend on extra money from the federal government to supplement their instruction. But I will also say that is not necessarily the most likely scenario of the several that are on the table here. Congress historically has supported federal funding for K-12 schools, even when the president has proposed cutting it. Most recent time that Donald Trump was in office, his annual budget proposals included major cuts to programs like Title I and the IDEA program for students with disabilities. And Congress essentially ignored those proposals and kept the funding relatively level. That's not to say that the same thing will happen again, but I think you'll once again see a debate. Another scenario for what will happen with the department is simply removing the department itself, but transferring the things that it does, its functions, to other departments. And so in that process, certain things could be cut or changed. There's sort of a lot that's unknown, but I think it's still there's a lot to unfold before we see how the Trump administration is going to make its mark on education.
Well, I think there's been two themes going on when we've been talking about and trying to break down and understand better of his myriad of executive orders. And I want to get into talking about what exactly is the role of the U.S. Department of Education. But before we get there, because you mentioned the unknown, and there's a lot of things that I think we'll be learning over the next couple of weeks or so. During the campaign trail, we've also heard nominations, or after elections, we've heard nominations of two people who will be leading the Department of Education. So can you kind of give us an idea of this narrative of, well, he has nominated two people to lead the Department of Ed, but at the same time wanting to dismantle it?
Yeah, I think that's part of the ongoing confusion in the broader education landscape about what will happen with the department. As I mentioned, a lot of what the department does, its individual functions are politically popular, even among Republican lawmakers and their constituents. And so, while one of my expert sources described getting rid of the department as an easy catchphrase, I think there will be some hurdles to overcome, before that were to actually happen. That said, as you point out, the department will have new leadership. assuming that his nominees for secretary and deputy secretary are confirmed. My colleagues at EdWeek have written extensively about both of them. Linda McMahon, the Secretary of Education nominee, and Penny Schwinn, the Deputy Secretary of Education nominee. I think I would say that the role that those people will play in shaping education policy, again, is something that will come into focus, I think, with the confirmation hearings. I would also say, just looking at the history of what those two people have championed, I think you'll see a big focus on career and technical education. I think you'll see a big focus on private school choice. And some of those initiatives are kind of counter to the concept of eliminating the federal government's role in education. So it's frustrating to sort of not have more concrete answers, but there's simply a lot that has yet to be clarified about what the Trump administration will do to kind of orient the federal government's role in education, which is complex, as you mentioned.
Right. And I think now is a really good time to sort of serve as a reminder of, what really is the role of the U.S. Department of Education and what has more power in shaping education? Is it national or state policies?
Yeah. So as a school finance reporter, one of the most common stats that I cite is that, there are three levels of government that supply the vast majority of money that public schools spend every year. It's about $900 billion total across the entire country. Those three levels are local, state, and federal. And local and state make up roughly 90 to 92% of that $900 billion total. And the remainder is the federal government. So sometimes that stat is used to say, well, the federal government doesn't have a big role in education funding, so it's not a big deal to kind of, remove it from the equation. I think there's a different way of looking at it, though, and I probably the more precise one, which is 8 to 10% on the whole. Translates to school districts that have 8 to 10% of their budget, or maybe even sometimes more, supplied by the federal government. And while removing that 8 to 10% would not be removing all the money, it would be removing a significant chunk of it, and it has a very direct effect on how many people a school can hire, how many programs it can offer, how many students it can serve, as robustly as it is legally required to, or as it would like to. And so I think historically, the role that the federal government's funding streams for schools have played is to attempt to kind of equalize the landscape of schools across the country. There's a lot of inequality in terms of how much local tax revenue schools can raise, how much money state governments decide to give their schools in any particular year based on economic conditions. And so the federal government is typically, with programs like Title I, for low-income students, Title III for English learners, IDEA for special education, is aiming to sort of provide schools with money to serve vulnerable groups of students who require more complex or more expensive services or instruction, and to kind of attempt to correct for some of the inequities that are otherwise there. There's lots of debate about how effective the federal government has been at doing that, but that historically has been, in the last half century, has been the role that the federal government plays.
Right. And I understand that this varies state by state, of course, depending on what kind of funding that they do receive, and also from local funding. But when cutbacks do happen, it seems like the ramifications in certain areas of education are typically pretty universal. Can you talk about what are the areas of education that are usually cut first, and what areas are most at risk?
Absolutely. Well, I think a big area that tends to be a focus of budget cuts, or at least kind of public attention, is on school administrators. There's often a lot of discussion about, we have too many administrators and not enough people in the classroom. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes, there are administrative positions that are redundant or excessive. But sometimes there are administrator positions that are really important. In a big school system with lots of different schools across a wide geographic area, it's really helpful and important to have people kind of looking at the whole landscape of the district and managing things from above, even as classroom instruction itself is kind of crucial and the core of what schools do. We hear a lot about people who are serving in kind of supplemental roles in classrooms, instructional aides, assistants for students with disabilities, people who are, providing support for classroom teachers, especially in cases where classroom teachers have lots of students with lots of complex needs. On a sheet of paper, when you're looking at budget items, sometimes you can say, well, we'll have a person in the classroom, so maybe we don't need as many of these, or we know we need, more people in the classroom, but we simply don't have the money. And so, beyond that, I think uh, one of the functions that the federal government played during the previous administration was to help schools kind of recover academically, to help students recover emotionally from the pandemic. And part of the impetus of the federal funds that schools received during that time was to, you know, supply extra tutoring, more summer school offerings, more after school offerings. These are all things that, maybe when you're looking at it from a budget perspective, if you only have a limited supply of funds, could be perceived as less essential or less, kind of core to the instructional experience for students. There's a lot of research that shows that programs like that have a lot of value. And I think for students, it's often self-evident that those programs have value, but, schools are constrained by the resources at their disposal. And so, those are all things that I would be looking out for, particularly if the federal government moves aggressively to, reduce its supply of funds for schools.
Well, and the list that you just shared is clearly a long list, and schools and school districts are grappling with a lot, especially over the last couple of years. And President Trump has also talked about more specific cuts to school districts that teach critical race theory and those that teach about trans rights. And CRT is something that we've been hearing a lot over the last couple of years. Can you remind us, what is CRT? Why is it such a big political talking point? And can funding cuts be targeted this way? And I know that's like three questions straight at you.
Yeah, I think, I'll just kind of characterize the broader series of debates over the issues you just raised, critical race theory in classrooms. We've heard about gender indoctrination. These are terms that I think are not really germane to the daily experience of most educators and most public school students in the United States. I think if you talk to school superintendents and teachers and even students, they're focused on math, reading, social studies, science, kind of the fundamentals. And I think there's kind of a broader concern or debate at the sort of on the political stage about what kind of history schools should be teaching, how schools should be talking to students about forming an identity, whether it's gender identity or sexual orientation, or even race. In terms of your question about kind of Trump's ability to influence how schools conduct themselves on those issues, it's sort of a mixed bag. The campaign materials that President Trump released in during the period between the election and the inauguration included a bullet item about withholding funds from schools that, as you say, teach critical race theory, or some of these other topics. That is not really a power that Trump directly has, or any president has. As I said, the federal government is supplying only a small portion of the overall funding that schools receive, and even beyond that, that funding is controlled by Congress, and any changes to appropriations would have to be come through a change in the law, which requires all kinds of political and bureaucratic hurdles. That said, the discussion of issues like that and the sort of the threat of the kind of ambient threat of removing funds from schools that do those things, or that require students to have had certain vaccines before they attend school, that can have a kind of indirect effect. Superintendents and school leaders are very wary of being targeted by governments, in terms of lawsuits and audits. They don't want to get into trouble. They want to be following the law as much as they can so that they're not, encumbered by distractions and costly legal fees. And so, you sort of the effect of some of the rhetoric that we're hearing is, maybe a degree of cautiousness on the part of educators, which I think, I'll leave it to other experts and some of my colleagues to talk about, some of the concerns around the importance of providing a really robust education on issues of race and gender in schools. But I think certainly an effect that we can expect is a reluctance to wade into areas that might be seen as controversial by those in power.
Well, clearly there are so many areas that we're going to be following in the future, and you yourself will be busy with these topics. So appreciate you breaking down a long list of things for us today. So I want to ask any final thoughts to leave our listeners with and sort of takeaways from this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I'll just kind of reiterate that, the federal government's role in education is significant, but it's not all encompassing. And I think there will be a lot of attention in the mainstream news media and, on TV and on the radio in the coming months on what Congress is doing, what the Department of Education is doing, how the Department of Education will operate. And those are very significant issues that deserve attention. But I would also encourage listeners and readers of Education Week's coverage to pay attention to what's happening at the state and local level too. Many states right now are in the process of forming their budgets and figuring out what's going to happen with school funding. And there's a lot of debate about various issues that are also playing out at the federal level. So I think it's important to know what's going on in your own state, states across the country, and there's sort of a lot more to education funding and politics than Congress. So it's kind of only part of the story, I think.
Well, we appreciate you sharing all those angles with us. You've been listening to Mark Lieberman, who's a school finance reporter with Education Week. Thank you so much, Mark, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we'll hear from Hartford Public Schools and the Connecticut Education Association. Let us know if you're a student or a parent of a student in Connecticut. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. President Donald Trump has promised to shut down the U.S. Department of Education, but that's not the only change to education we might see in the months ahead. This week, President Trump revoked protections that prevent ICE agents from conducting arrests at previously protected places like schools. On Tuesday, Where We Live spoke with Jimena Bustillo, who's our DHS and immigration policy reporter at NPR. She shared what this might look like across the country.
Immigration enforcement is definitely a patchwork across the country. There are states and cities that have individual ordinances and laws that prohibit their local law enforcement from assisting federal immigration law enforcement in these kinds of initiatives. It really kind of depends. There are these protected locations, such as I mentioned, schools and churches, places of worship, but at the same time, it is such a patchwork.
Today, we're joined by local educators to talk about that and more, including the future of public education in our state. Joining us now is Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, who is the superintendent of Hartford Public Schools. And also with us is Jocelyn Delancey. She's the vice president of Connecticut Education Association and also president of the Connecticut Education Foundation. And also with us is Alex Putterman. He's a reporter for Connecticut Insider that covers education. And a reminder for our listeners that if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Superintendent, I want to start with you first. Can you respond to what we've heard so far from President Trump and his promises to cut education funding, and more recently, also taking away protections that prevent ICE agents from conducting arrests in schools?
Yes, these are all very concerning. When I think about just the fact of potential cuts to funding, we think about the entitlement grants, and for us in Hartford, right, we serve a higher concentration of need, and overall, it's about $16 million in entitlement funds, right? When we think about Title I, which is specifically focused on improving academic achievement for low-income students, and supporting our educators to be at their best in support of our students, those are significant implications. I reflect on the recent orders about schools and churches and hospitals now being fair game, if you will. We were talking about young people in schools, right? Schools are places where students, our staff, our families are partners in the work. And so we want to maintain the safety. And so it adds an added layer of angst for students and for our educators.
Well, and I know this is something that you and your district have been preparing to respond for ICE agents showing up to conduct arrests, but even more so this week, I think with the new news coming up, does that change how you operate, or is it going to be more robust, or did that change anything really?
So the directive, the guidance still remains, and a lot of the guidance from 2017 we resurfaced and are empowering our educators and even our families and our school leaders with the information and the fact that we know that locally and in our state we have additional guardrails, if you will. Nonetheless, we have been very explicit that if an agent does show up at the door, that we are expecting to inquire about an actual warrant that is signed by a judge. I think a lot of this requires time for families to understand not just what the legalities are, but also how we in schools and in our community are going to support students and families.
And Alex, I want to bring you into the conversation. Can you respond to what we've heard from the superintendent just now, and also with the Bridgeport School District in regards to immigrant agents conducting arrests at local schools?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that every school district in the state is probably having these conversations about. It's something that a few months ago you didn't have to worry about, and now, as of this week, you do have to worry about it. I mean, one thing that I was just thinking about as I heard the superintendent talking was what could these school districts and these educators have been doing with the time that they're now spending worrying about these contingencies that didn't exist. It's very striking.
Well, in our last conversation, we heard from Mark Lieberman, who's an education reporter or school finance reporter from Education Week, on how states might withstand cuts onto their education funding. So how is the state legislature starting to think about these cutbacks, especially now they're in session?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think, a lot of people in Connecticut, including maybe at this table, think that the state could be doing more with state funding for education. Mm-hmm. And that has been a subject of conversation so far in this legislative session. In particular, legislators seem to have some interest in more money for special education. Mm-hmm. If the federal government cuts funding, that puts the state in kind of a difficult situation where, and you see this in a lot of different issues. You see this when it comes to Medicaid funding, for example, as well, where maybe some lawmakers are interested in increasing funding, but if federal money disappears, you wind up just kind of patching holes and spending a lot of state money just to sort of get back to where we started before the federal money went away.
Well, and Jocelyn, I'd love for you to respond to this as well. You were an elementary school teacher for 17 years. What are you hearing from teachers?
So I think teachers are really concerned because our priority, two things. One, to make sure that our students are in safe and thriving learning communities, but also to educate our students. And as Alex just said, what could we be doing with the time that we're sitting here trying to understand policies, making sure that we're doing everything in the way that we're supposed to be doing? We should be taking that time to care for our students, understand our students' needs, and then deliver instruction that meets those needs. And so every moment that we have to spend fighting for funding or for better understanding or training in something new that we might have to implement is time away from what we do best, which is educate our students and make sure that they are in these communities that are dynamic and fun and engaging. And now we're sitting here thinking about what could happen if we are mandated to do certain things. And it just takes the joy out of what we do even more than some of the other burdens that we have in front of us.
Right, and talking about earlier, all of the things that school districts and teachers are already grappling with. So this is another extra layer on top of all of the things. And I think everyone at this table, including Mark Lieberman from EdWeek, have mentioned special education. Can you talk about what might happen to special education funding, and what does that landscape look like right now?
So I think it's, in my mind, the uncertainty makes it even harder. And we've had uncertainty with special education funding, both from federal funds and from our state. Our state has not fully funded their kind of end of the bargain on excess costs for special education. And the federal government hasn't always kind of honored that. And so now you're thinking about the fact that we've been kind of screaming into the abyss about how to fund our schools. And now we're thinking about that we're going to even have less funding. And in my mind, it's the state's responsibility to set the tone. Well, really the federal government's responsibility, but then also the state's responsibility to set the tone and tenor for how we invest in our public education. And so we really need our state to set a positive and proactive tone about how we're going to ensure that our public education system in Connecticut stays strong and thriving, and that's going to cost.
Well, and talking about the state, Alex, this year, our legislature's education committee will be prioritizing special education, and according to reporting from the Connecticut Mirror. Can you elaborate on what we might see and how Connecticut might make up for those costs?
Yeah, so this is something that educators, superintendents have talked about for years, that the state doesn't do enough in the realm of special education. Without going too into the weeds of how education funding works in Connecticut, districts get a little bit more money if they are educating students eligible for free and reduced lunch. They get a little bit extra money if they're educating students for whom English is not their first language. They don't currently get that extra money for special education students. Even though, some would argue special education students do require more resources, it's a little bit more expensive to educate them. So the proposal that I think a lot of people are hoping to see this session would be to sort of change that formula so that districts do get extra money for special education, which will help, probably most, if not all districts, but might particularly help some of the more challenged districts, which tend to have higher percentage of students who are on IEPs and who would draw that extra funding.
Well, I have two sort of funding cuts related questions for Jocelyn and Superintendent Torres Rodriguez. I'm going to go with Jocelyn first here. Are you concerned that teachers are going to bear the brunt of funding costs? Certainly, this is not a new area.
They already are, right? I think if you look at districts that have already made significant cuts for one reason or another, you can see the impact that teachers are bearing the brunt. Their class sizes are larger. They lose their instructional paraprofessional and support professionals in classrooms that make them have to then take less time for each student. And so I think we already see that brunt and that burden, right. But I think that it's taking a larger toll than people realize. And it's a worry for us in terms of one of our highest significant indicators on our most recent survey is what are teachers worried about? Stress and burnout is one of our top issues. And we need people to help us make our conditions better so that we can do what we do best.
And Superintendent, more detailed question for you in terms of over 400 positions were cut in Hartford Public Schools this year. I imagine that's a very high number according to our reporting at Connecticut Public. How do you respond to this? As we know, teachers are stretched thin. There might be even more funding cuts. What's going through your mind?
Yes, and the sunsetting of those federal pandemic relief funds really impacted our opportunity to deliver right for young people. While the majority of those positions were relative to the pandemic relief funding, nonetheless, those were resources that were desperately needed before the pandemic so that we could be really at foundational levels. I think oftentimes people forget in communities like the ones that I serve that we have for quite some time been figuring out how to do the foundational work with less. And so we're now at a situation in which it has completely been exacerbated. And as I think about special education, I mean, the fact that we currently have about 180 total positions vacant, half of those are relative to special education. And it doesn't include our paraeducators. And so already the system, our educators are completely stretched. And that does take a toll, not only in what the quality of education is for the student, but also the experience that our educators are able to have and provide. And it becomes a system-wide issue.
And Alex, I know we can talk for days in terms of the cuts to Hartford Public Schools, but are there any areas that you're looking out for in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that Hartford, with those 400 lost positions, was probably the most extreme example in Connecticut of something that almost every district was grappling with. And we saw across the state when those federal pandemic relief funds that the superintendent mentioned, when those went away, we saw cuts in Hamden, we saw cuts in Enfield, in Stratford, in Danbury, certainly in New Haven. And then Hartford, maybe had a little bit bigger number than a lot of other districts, but that has been sort of a big story across Connecticut, across the country over the past year in education. You had that funding, and then the funding goes away, and it has definitely created some holes.
And Jocelyn, I think over the last couple of years too, there's been a lot of conversation about early childhood education and primary education, which we understand strong education really sets kids up for their education career. So when you're hearing about these funding cuts, I know it's not new news, but how do you react to that when it's happening again? And are you worried that this will impact how early education functions?
Well, I think that our earliest education is one of our most critical and our most important, and oftentimes the one that's dismissed the most as not necessarily in the need of funding or a space. We don't have universal pre-K here in Connecticut. I think that it's something to consider. I think that we need to understand that the foundations that our students get at the earliest time sets them up for success as they grow. And it's not in necessarily the academic skills, but in the kind of the soft skills, the problem solving, the creativity, the resilience, kind of that ability to bounce back and learn from your, play, right? And so I think that as we get into this, we can't rob Peter to pay Paul, so to speak, in the sense of if we're investing, we have to invest in all of the areas, and it will cost. I think that people want a really good public education system in Connecticut, but they don't necessarily really want to pay for it. And I think that if you want something good and done right and well, and you're focusing on efficiencies, that's not going to happen. You're not going to get the best of the best. And that's what our students and families deserve in Connecticut, and that's what we should be striving for.
Well, and many teachers are working or have worked to create a space where students can play, and they're also striving to create a safe classroom environment for all of their students. So I have sort of a twofold question here: is students that might be immigrants, students of color, and students that are part of the LGBTQ plus community. What could some of President Trump's proposed policy and rhetoric mean for these students, and how will teachers continue to create supported classroom environments for all of their students?
So I think that it means a lot in terms of feeling safe and secure. I think students from vulnerable communities already go to school feeling nervous and insecure, depending on the district, how well they have, school climate policy in place, what they're already doing to keep kids feeling safe and secure and supported. I think that as we go, our educators, again, want nothing but the best for their students, and safety is paramount. If you don't feel safe in a classroom, you're not learning, period. And so I think that that's something that we have to make sure that in Connecticut that we do really well, is keep our students feeling safe and secure, and our educators need to feel safe and secure so that we can do the work that we do best.
Well, and Superintendent, what are your thoughts in terms of creating a safe environment and how teachers can continue to do that?
I think it's something that we at all levels of an organization have to model and continue to communicate through policy, but also through programming. And when I speak with our students, and now I think this is where all the conversation kind of wraps up, where students say, Superintendent, what's going to happen to my friend who is undocumented, who, is afraid? How can I help? And so we know that our students and our teachers are having those conversations, but they're hard conversations, and creating a space for a 7-year-old to grapple with, well, my parent was talking to me about our guardianship succession plan because of what might happen. Those are the conversations that are happening in our schools with our teachers, with our social workers. And so creating this space, empowering educators with the information, and also communicating with families as to what the resources are.
And we're going to take a moment here to grab a call from Tom, who's calling in from Manchester. Tom, you're on the air.
Yes, real quickly. I'm a person of color, and I'm just concerned with the anti-diversity and pushback from the Trump administration about the teaching of history, literature, or persons of color, that it's not a threat to, white children, but as a person of color, our history is important. It's just a matter of balancing it out. And also anti-immigration theme about, persons of color south of the border, Haitians. I didn't like his covert racist remarks, and I think we're just shouldn't whitewash our history, even in pleasant times. And second, I think the rise of hate groups and demagogues out there and politicians concern me too. And we need to have more open-minded parents, regardless of your political affiliations and beliefs, to work together as America. This is 1954. This is the 21st century, 2025. So we just have to deal with confirmation bias, racism, sexism, and that we all built up this country. Because my late mother was an immigrant from Bermuda.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your story there, and also for your, I think, questions in two parts that I'm going to ask both Jocelyn and the superintendent. Jocelyn, let's just go with you first. Respond to what Tom just shared.
So I agree. It is a concern. I'm thankful to be in Connecticut. I think that we have legislation that we've put in place previously that protects some of our curriculum, that protects some of the teaching and learning, and making sure that we can be honest and in our truth and our history. I think that there's legislation this session that has been proposed from different viewpoints, some that actually take those rights and protections away, and others that actually add more protections for educators and for students in terms of learning. I think there's legislation being proposed about protecting our books and what we can have access to. So I'm very hopeful, again, that Connecticut sets themselves apart as a leader so that we can make sure that we're doing this right.
One thing I'll extend there is that, when we think about the power of education, we want our young people to be able to engage in dialogue about how they are different, how they see things different, how they're going to experience the world the same or different. And so as educators, we have a responsibility to create spaces for that dialogue, whether, we're in agreement or not. There is a skill in finding an opportunity to have a conversation and identify common ground or not. And I don't want that to be lost in these conversations.
I would just add really quick that there's nothing more democratic than a public education system. We as residents and voters have the opportunity to speak at public comment, elect our decision makers in all capacities, in our finance boards, in our boards of ed. And so people who are concerned about this, I think, use that democratic process. Go to your boards of ed, speak to the people that you need to speak to, and make sure that your voice is heard, including in local elections that, I think historically people don't use and take for advantage of in terms of their ability to protect their own school districts.
Well, and Alex, I'm really curious to hear from your experience if you've heard any conversation regarding to curriculum from parents or teachers or students.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that usually that's something that is kind of determined at the local level, and that school districts have the ability to control. And I think typically, maybe the personal opinions of the president or the Department of Education aren't going to make that much of a difference in what's being taught in your kid's third grade classroom or, U.S. history class in middle school or something. And the idea that that might change, I think, is definitely alarming to people, that, just because somebody in Washington has a certain viewpoint, that is going to affect what your kid is taught. And I think these things have been increasingly contentious over the last, 5-10 years, where I think there has been a lot more spotlight on I feel bad sometimes for teachers. The idea that you might say something and a kid goes home and tells their parent, and all of a sudden it's in the news and they're suing and demanding that you be fired. And I cannot imagine that is a fun atmosphere for teachers to be teaching in, watching their words with everything that they say.
Well, we've been talking about all things education here, and our panel will be staying with us. If you have a question about the future of public education here in Connecticut, we would love to hear from you. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. President Donald Trump has promised major changes to education in the U.S., but what could that mean here in Connecticut? With us to unpack all of this is Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, who's a superintendent of Hartford Public Schools, Jocelyn Delancey, who's a vice president of Connecticut Education Association, and also Alex Putterman, who's a reporter for Connecticut Insider. So, Jocelyn, you mentioned earlier before that there are so many teacher vacancies in the state. Are you concerned about all this rhetoric around cutting education funding that we're going to see less teachers enter the profession?
Yes, I do. I think that people who are looking for what kind of career that they want to have, they want a couple of things. They want to know that they have security, that they have a path to success, and that they're going to get paid well. And I think that what we're seeing from our young students, and also people who would be second career educators, is this really the environment that I want to work in? And we have school districts now that teachers will go to start a new opportunity, and then the next year they announce that they're cutting 12 to 15 positions, and because they were just hired, they're on that. So they've taken a risk and they've moved to a new space. They've committed to supporting the public school students in that district, and then all of a sudden they've been there maybe 2 years, maybe not even, and now their position is on the chopping block. And so there's a lot of inconsistency there. It's hard for us to sell, come on in, join us, when these conditions just continue to devolve.
And Alex, I want to touch on this with you. Earlier, Mark Lieberman from Ed Week mentioned this briefly. President Trump is also a proponent for school choice. So can you remind us of what that means and what the new administration could mean for charter schools in Connecticut?
Yeah, I think that's another issue where there's kind of a wait and see what exactly can or will the federal government do. But school choice in charter schools is always a hot topic here in Connecticut, very divisive in education circles. Some people think that more choice is better, and it allows students to sort of escape their neighborhood schools if their schools aren't giving them what they need. On the other hand is the argument that if you start giving more public money to schools of choice, it's going to leave the neighborhood schools in a worse shape, and the kids who are sort of left behind in those neighborhood schools are going to suffer for it. Like I said, this is something that comes up in Connecticut frequently. There are a couple of charter schools currently across the state that are kind of in limbo. Every year, the legislature kind of debates what should happen, and there are different factions. The Trump administration appears to be very pro-choice. They've talked about, universal choice. In areas like this, I kind of wonder, is this really a top priority for them? They've said a lot of things about a lot of different issues. Is this the one that they're going to really go to the mat for? So far, this week, I certainly haven't heard, I don't recall that President Trump mentioned school choice in his inaugural address or anything like that. But it will definitely be interesting to see once the new Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, who of course comes from Connecticut, once she is confirmed, what is their posturing and what exactly can they do on this issue that is more than just sort of stating their preference for more school choice.
And really quickly, Mark, I would love to bring you back in. Mark Lieberman, who's a school finance reporter from Ed Week. I'm curious to hear if there's anything you want to add to that, or is that something that you're hearing too in the sort of national sense?
Yeah, I'll echo what Alex said. I think there's certainly a question about whether school choice is at the top of the priority list for the Trump administration. We're hearing about this congressional proposal for a new tax credit scholarship program. The House was already advancing that proposal before Trump even took office. I think you'll definitely see more discussion of that proposal at the federal level. But I also think that may not be the number one thing that the administration is pushing. Having said that, there is quite a bit of activity at the state level, not really in Connecticut, but in many states. Right now, Texas, Tennessee, Idaho, Wyoming, the list actually goes on. There's quite a few others, are all either considering programs to expand private school choice or considering new programs that essentially allocate public funds for private education, for parents to spend on private education. So there's certainly a lot happening in that world. And I think it's very much aligned with kind of the policy priorities of the Republican Party more broadly. But I don't necessarily foresee that being the number one focus of the administration. And there is a debate to be had about how much of an effect those programs have on the public school system, but I think it's certainly part of the conversation. And going back to what I said earlier, why it's important to be paying attention to what's happening at the state level, because often political priorities can be, handled from a variety of angles. So plenty more to look at there in the months ahead, I think.
Well, thank you so much for that clarification, Mark. And we've got a couple minutes here, so I would love to sort of go down the line here and ask everyone for just a couple of final thoughts. But starting with the superintendent, we'd love to hear too, what do you want students and parents of public school districts to know right now?
I wanted to know that our priority remains that we are a safe and inclusive learning places and spaces across all of our 42 school campuses, and that we will stay calm, we will stay alert, and we will be prepared so that we can continue to support our educators, our families, and our students. And specifically as it relates to resources in the community, I will say we have the Institute for Refugees and Immigrants, the American Place at the Hartford Public Library, the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, and the Institute for Hispanic Family and the Center for Latino Progress, local partners that are at the ready, shoulder to shoulder with us to support.
Jocelyn, same question to you. What do you hope students and parents know right now?
So I would echo a lot of what the superintendent said, but I would also include that this is a partnership. We need to make sure that we are staying partners, that we're working together, problem solving together, listening to the people who are in the rooms where this is happening so that we know the best solutions to the problems that come forward. And I think that, again, our priority is to keep our students safe, protect their rights, and make sure that we're able to educate them the best that we can.
Well, and Alex, as you continue to cover this, there are so many things going on, but what do you hope our listeners take away from today's conversation?
One thing that has come up a few times in this conversation is that while the federal stuff gets a lot of attention, it is often the state and local debates that sort of have the biggest impact on your kid. So, I spend some time at the Capitol, so I have kind of a state government focus. And, I wonder if the average listener, realizes that this debate about education funding is starting and going on right now, that, special education in particular, but I know that a lot of the districts would like to see funding for education more broadly. And so I guess listeners probably feel all sorts of different ways about what the Trump administration is doing. But if that seems overwhelming and sort of hard to touch, you can not only follow, but also get involved with what's happening at the state capitol or at your local Board of Ed level, and probably have a little bit of say in where all of this lands.
Well, thank you so much for that. You've been listening to Alex Putterman, who's a reporter for Connecticut Insider. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
And you are also listening to Jocelyn Delancey, who's the Vice President of Connecticut Education Association and President of the Connecticut Education Foundation. Thanks so much, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much.
And you were also listening to Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez, who is the Superintendent of Hartford Public Schools. Superintendent, appreciate your time.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
And also earlier with us was Mark Lieberman, who's a school finance reporter with EdWeek. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.